it was kind of funny in thinking about getting these sermon notes already and trying to get the event back up. I wish they would just call it like sermon notes rather than events, but I suppose it is an event that we're coming here and we're getting together. But in doing that and in preparing that, I quickly realized that there are certain things that have to be put in certain order in order to get everything working properly. I also realized that the last time I had done one of these events, it wound up being, before we did the name change, before we dropped the Christian Center and added the church. So it's been some years back, which also meant that whatever email address and account I was using to create those had been eliminated off of the Bible app, and so that account was dead. So I was on the way here this morning, and I'm thinking, we'll just do what we've always been doing, and we'll just kind of wing it. And then as I'm doing the thing that I shouldn't do, with improper priorities, and I should be driving and focusing on the road, and instead I'm Googling and using my knee to steer and glancing up, and I realize, I can figure out how to get this up and going. So I pulled over, and Genevieve drove the rest of the way here, and Reagan handed me up the MacBook, and I started typing in that, and then I realized that I had forgotten to do something else that is necessary in order to have a working computer. You've got to charge it. It wasn't charged. So then I'm like, all right, well, I'll just pull it up on my phone. And then as I'm trying to figure it all out on my phone, we hit about Lucas, and I realized the other reason that I try to do it while I'm at home, I had no internet. So I had to wait until I got here. So that's what I've been doing for the last 15 minutes. So I know Michael will enjoy those. Michael, did you find it? You got it. See, Michael is already on the ball. Mom's got it too. Genevieve, I see on her phone, she's got it. And Nancy's got it. See, it's beneficial. It saves you guys a little bit of time. You can go the hard way. Shanda's got the Bible. She's got, I'm sure, a notepad, pen. You're ready to go. The hard way, the old way, the reliable way. There we go. Because if you lose internet connection, what are you going to do? Shanda's still got her pen and paper. And I kind of do a combo of all of those, but I figure I've already got the notes. It really only takes me an extra 5 minutes. And then in case you forget or in case something comes up and you're not here, as long as you got internet access, you got the sermon notes and you can study along on your own. But as I'm doing this, I'm noticing that there was a problem that I had. The problem that led up to the problem this morning was that I was not doing things in order. Maybe it was because I wasn't as focused as I ought to have been. Maybe it was because I didn't really prioritize creating this event like I thought I was going to 3 or 4 weeks ago when the idea popped back in my head. And because of not prioritizing it, it became an afterthought. And because it became an afterthought, it wound up creating more problems. I don't know if anybody can relate to the pressures of life, the struggles that we face, all of the demands that we have on our time that wind up pulling us in all these different directions to the point that sometimes we drop the ball on something and then it creates problems. Maybe you can relate to that with some of your relationships as well. This is something that I often struggle with. Because I just figure, hey, if you haven't told me there's a problem, then we've got no problem. And I've come to realize there are people that doesn't mean there's no problem. I have to follow up with them. I have to talk to them. I have to, kind of nurture those relationships. And communication is required, and focusing and giving attention and really prioritizing those relationships is something that is necessary, because if I don't, we have problems, even though I didn't think there was a problem, and I won't realize there's a problem until all of a sudden the idea pops in my head while driving to church, and a charger is not connected, and the computer is not working, and I got no internet connection, and then it's like, oh yeah, there's a problem maybe I should have talked to that individual ahead of time. Maybe I should have communicated a little bit more. This happens often in our spiritual lives as well, because we think everything is good and everything feels good and everything seems to be going good until it's not. And then when it's not going good, it's like, oh, we got a big problem. Where did we go wrong? And often as a pastor, when somebody comes up to me and they're like, hey, just feels like I've been struggling spiritually. You know what one of my first questions is? Have you been praying? Have you been reading your Bible? Have you been studying God's Word? Have you been asking God to lead you daily? And what I found 100% of the time is when people are struggling spiritually, the answer to those questions is no, or not as much as I should be. And that just depends on how honest they want to be. You see, it requires focus. It requires attention. Really, all relationships require prioritizing things. And if we were to try to talk about how to have better relationships and how to improve our spiritual life, or how to improve our marriage, how to improve our family dynamic, how to improve our job life, if we were to try to answer those things and we were to Google it, Google would spit out your top 10 list. The top 10 things to do to have a better marriage. The top 10 things to do to improve your relationship with God. And you know what? Before Google ever came out with top 10 lists, before anybody ever came out with a top 10 list, God came out with a top 10 list. It's called the 10 Commandments. And what we're going to be doing over the next 10 weeks, that's right, I've got a big, long sermon series here. We're going over God's top 10, the Big 10. It is the 10 Commandments. And see, these 10 Commandments, they're more than just a list of do's and don'ts. And I have looked at them for so many years and I'm like, thou shalt do this, thou shalt not do this. It's telling us what to do and what not to do. So it's a list of do's and don'ts. But it is so much more than a list of do's and don'ts. So much more than a list of do's and don'ts. It's really a list of priorities, or a list of principles for our lives. That's what it is. It's a list of principles. And if you want to look at it as do's and don'ts, that's what you're going to get out of it. If all you look at is the 10 Commandments as this is just a list of do's and don'ts. And you know what? There's even some people that I'll say it's the 10 Commandments and they're like, well, where does it actually say it's the 10 Commandments? Because I've read Exodus chapter 20 and I've read Deuteronomy chapter 5. That's where the 10 Commandments are, by the way. But it doesn't say 10 Commandments in any there. It just says God says this and write it down. But it is called the 10 Commandments. And just so you know, and just so we can clarify things, in Exodus chapter 34, verse 28, look at this. It says, so he was there with the Lord, this is Moses, 40 days and 40 nights. He neither ate bread nor drank water, and he wrote on the tablets the word of the covenant, the 10 Commandments. It was actually written down, the 10 Commandments. These are the 10 Commandments, but yes, they are more than just do's and don'ts. They're more than just a list of rules that we are to follow. These are principles for living that will improve all of our relationships. The 10 Commandments will really improve all of our relationships, not just our relationship with God, but our relationship with our spouse, our relationship with our children, our relationship with our family, our relationships with our friends, our relationship with our coworkers, our relationship with the community at large will be improved just by following these principles for living that are known as the 10 Commandments. I want you to look at the beginning of this, and we're going to spend quite a bit of time here in Exodus, so go ahead and turn with me to Exodus chapter 20. Again, I told you that Deuteronomy chapter 5 has the other list in there, but I like the Exodus 20 version of it, mostly because it came first. But Exodus 20, I want us to look here right at the beginning, before we even get into the list of these 10 Commandments. The list of the 10 Commandments will go from verse 3 down through 17. But if we start off and we look up here at verse 1 and 2, God spoke all of these words saying, verse 2, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. He's starting right out here and he's like, hey, this is a relationship that we've got. There's a reason I'm communicating to you. And he's communicating to Moses at the time, but he's like, I am the Lord, your God. Not just somebody else's God. I am your God. I'm the one that brought you out of the land of Egypt. I'm the one that brought you out of bondage. And when we often read this in context, we can sit there and say, yeah, but God was just writing this to the Israelites. He's just writing it to them because he brought them out of Egypt. Well, yes, he brought them out of Egypt, and yes, he brought them out of bondage, but he also brought us out of bondage as well. Romans chapter 6, verse 6 says that knowing this, that our old man was crucified with him, that the body of sin might be done away with, we should no longer be slaves to sin. We would no longer be in bondage to sin. We would no longer be held in captivity to sin. Just like the Israelites were held in captivity to the Egyptians, we were held in captivity to sin. And God's trying to tell us all, he's like, hey, I'm the Lord your God. What I'm about to tell you is for your benefit. And I'm telling you this because I am your God. And I am the one who brought you out of bondage. If all we do is look at this as a list of do's and don'ts, that's all we're going to get out of it. But if we will look at this as more than just rules, if we will truly see this as priorities for living and that it is to help us with our relationships, that's what we're going to get out of it. What are you going to get out of this message today? What are you going to get out of this series? What are you willing to see in this? Are all you going to do is just look at a list of rules, a list of do's and don'ts, or are you willing to actually see it as the priorities for life that God had intended it for? Because you're the one that's going to determine what you get out of this. Just like you're the one that determines what you're going to get out of your relationship with God. You're the one that's going to determine how deep your relationship with God is. It's all on you. I can't do this for you. You're the one that determines the depth of your relationship with God. Is it going to be a shallow surface relationship, or are you going to go deeper than you ever have with Him? It's on you. The thing that I want us to get about this is that the 10 Commandments are all about relationships. It is all about relationships. All of it is. God's starting off in Exodus 2:2 or 22, and He's saying, I am the Lord your God. Then He gives these priorities or these principles. He gives them. He lays them out for us. But I want you to see what happens after He gives these 10 commandments. Jump down here, Exodus chapter 20. We're going to read verse 18 down through 21. It says, now all the people witnessed the thunderings, the lightning flashes, the sound of the trumpet, and the mountain smoking. And when the people saw it, they trembled and stood afar off. Then they said to Moses, you speak with us, and we will hear. But let not God speak with us, lest we die. And Moses said to the people, do not fear, for God has come to test you, and that His fear may be before you, so that you may not sin. So the people stood afar off, but Moses drew near the thick darkness where God was. Do you see what's happening here? Moses is drawing near to God. Moses is determined that he's going to go deep with God. He doesn't just want somebody to relay the message to him. He wants to hear it for himself. The people of Israel, they were afraid. And it says why they were afraid. Look at that in verse 19. Verse 19, it says, let not God speak with us, lest we die. They were afraid of dying. They were afraid that if they were in God's presence, they would die. Well, guess what? Flesh will always die in the presence of God. If your flesh gets in your way and it gets in the presence of God, it will die. Every single time. Now that shouldn't be something that we're afraid of. That should be something we're rejoicing over, because I don't want my flesh to lead me. I want my spirit to lead me. Which means I want the flesh to die. And we see exactly how to do it. Draw near to God. Get close to God. But that's not what they wanted. Moses was determined that that's what he was going to get. Moses was determined, I'm going to get a deep relationship with God. But the Israelites, they were determined, they just wanted a relationship through Moses. Sounds a lot like many churches today. Many churches today that show up on a Sunday morning and say, well, Pastor, I hope you've got a good word that God has brought for us. Well, I hope that God has been speaking to you for the last 7 days as well. Because it shouldn't just be about what I'm bringing on Sundays. What were you getting from Him on Mondays and Tuesdays and Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturdays? You should be in His presence daily. Because if you're not, then you're just like the people of Israel wanting to stand afar off and being like, I don't want to get too close to God. Because if I get too close to God, well, some of those things that I like doing might have to die. And I like what I like too much to let it die. You determine the depth of your relationship with God. Look at this one here. Here's another thing that goes along with this. In Psalm chapter 103, verse 7. He made known His ways to Moses, His acts to the children of Israel. Do you see the difference there? He made known to Moses His ways. But to the children of Israel, it was just His whats. Moses got to figure out why. The children of Israel only got to figure out what. They only saw what God was doing, and yet Moses was invited in to learn why God was doing it. Somebody that has a deep relationship with me asks me, why do you do the things you do? I will tell them because they have a deep relationship with me. People that don't know me, that just want to question what I'm doing and say, well, why did you do that? Well, that's none of your business. I don't know you and you don't know me, and I've got no reason to explain myself to you. But if I have a relationship with somebody, I'll tell them. People have questioned me over the years with how we deal with our children. Everything that I have done to correct our children, at some point in time or another, they will ask, why? And I will always tell them why. Now, sometimes they don't like the answer why. Because sometimes the answer is, I'm dad. You're not. Sometimes when you go to God and you say, God, why did you do this? He's like, I'm dad. You're not. But other times you go before God and you say, why do you do this? And He's like, come here. Let me tell you. If you go down this path, there's nothing but destruction in front of you. I've been there. I've seen it. I've done it. I know everything. Trust me. As parents, we've done that as well. And yet what happens oftentimes with our children when we tell them, don't do this. I've been there, I've done that. It's going to hurt. And what do? They get hurt. What happens to us when God says, don't do this? I sent my son, so I've been there, I've done that, and you're going to get hurt. And what do we, as His children, do? We get hurt. But when we can get closer to Him in our relationship with Him and determine that I want to go deeper with Him, He will not only just show us what He does and His acts, He will show us why He does it. He will reveal the bigger picture to us, where all of a sudden we start to see what God is going to do before He does it, because we know His ways. I want to know His ways. I want to be able to walk with God and know His ways so I know what's coming next. When He's sitting here and He's saying that God's make known His ways to Moses and His acts to the children of God, He's saying that people that don't want a deep relationship with me, people that only want to show up once a week and then just whatever pastor has for me, that's all I'm going to listen to. All you know is what He does. All you know is His acts. But Moses was going deep with God. Moses was right there with him, walking with him. He was spending 40 days in the wilderness with him. He was trying to learn from him. And because of that, God started to show him his ways. He started to show him why. See, the 10 Commandments are all about relationships, more than do's and don'ts, more than rules. These are principles. And this first principle that we see in the list of the 10 Commandments is the principle of priority. That's why I kept slipping up and saying priority all day. It's the principle of priority. Look at it in Exodus chapter 20, verse 3. Writing this down, God says, "You shall have no other gods before me." No other gods before me. Okay, here's the one thing you didn't think you were going to get this morning. You did not think that you were going to get Professor Joshua. You thought you were going to get Pastor Josh. Well, guess what? Professor Joshua, who is a professor in English, is here to give you an English lesson. You didn't think you were going to get it. You probably don't want to get it. You're probably already thinking about it. I didn't like school the first time I went through it. Why are you making me go through it again? Well, it's because this is important. That word before can be used one of two ways in the English language. It can either be used as a conjunction or a preposition. A conjunction joins two thoughts. A preposition clarifies a thought. Here is a preposition. You ready? I am going to the store. To the store is a preposition. It's still a sentence if I drop off the preposition and say, I am going. Noun and verb. I am going. That is a complete sentence. But to clarify the sentence, we put in the preposition of to the store. This, if we just stop right after God's, that's a complete sentence. You shall have no other gods. But there's a preposition there before me. It's a preposition which means it clarifies the thought. This is not a conjunction which joins two thought. Because many people will sit there and say, oh, you shall have no other gods before me, but I can have gods after you. So I can still worship the Minnesota Vikings on Sunday afternoons when they play by jumping up and raising my hands and shouting. No, you cannot. Well, I can still have all of these other things that I love and that I worship that are gods to me. No, you cannot. You see, here was one of the interesting things, because if you've known me for any point of time, any length of time, I love studying words. Words mean things. Words are important. If we don't understand words, if we don't understand and have a common meaning, we're destroyed. We just fight and we argue and we bicker over things. Because what one word means to you might mean something different to me. We may agree on the same principles, but just use different words. So you've got to get to the meaning of words. Well, I looked up this preposition before. I've got this app. It's called Logos. It is a huge Bible software that breaks it down. What I found is that this preposition is used in the Bible over 5,000 times. What I found is the times that it was used in before, I actually couldn't figure out how many. Like, I pull this up and I do the Bible study, and it has like this wheel, and it's got all these colors. The second most used one that was in there, if I can find it, I've got it in my notes, was against. That preposition, the same word, but it was translated against, was 269 times. And what it does is the very first one was like 500 times, and it was on. And I'm like, you shall have no other gods on me? That doesn't make sense. But you shall have no other gods against me? Kind of makes sense. I started going through this, and on this little graph and this wheel, this chart, each one, the different colors, they get smaller and smaller and smaller based on how many times or how few times it was there. And I started to look at some other ones, like over and with and in front of, beside, under, next to, by, because of, or near. I'm like, all of those could have been used and could have worked in some way, but they would all give a different meaning. And if this was a conjunction joining two meanings, it would be confusing. But it's a preposition, and it's really meant to be clarification. Well, as I started going down, I got to where there were only 3 uses. Words that had 3 uses, like near, had only been used 3 times. And I still hadn't got to before. The point I'm trying to make is that this word before, it's really only found in the King James and like the New King James. I don't know if you can even pull that up out of the New Living there, Nancy. I'm putting you on the spot, but if you can pull this one, Exodus 20 verse 3 out of the New Living, it uses it differently. The Message uses differently. The English Standard uses differently. I like the Holman Christian Standard because the Holman Christian Standard says you shall have no other gods, only me. And it's like, that is the point that it is trying to make. Were you able to find that one, Nancy, out of the New Living? I know I'm putting you on the spot real fast. I'm typically nicer and try to give you a little bit of a heads up of where I'm going and what I'm doing, but you never know. And I'm not even going to try to pull it up on my phone. Yeah, see, it uses besides. Don't worship any other gods besides me. And that conveys that same meaning of only me. See, here's the thing, and this is like the second point that I want to try to make in here. You should worship God only. When it comes to this principle of priority, worship God only. This isn't a before, which means, I can worship somebody after. No, worship only God. Worship only God. And here's the thing, understand the context. Again, this is the people of Israel. What we don't realize often is that the people of Israel at this moment, God is leading them out of bondage. He has led them out of the captivity. They were slaves in Egypt for 430 years just prior to this. And the Egyptians, polytheistic, poly meaning many, theistic meaning God. They had many gods. They had 29 main gods, 2,000 lesser gods. There were a whole lot of them. And what God is trying to convey through Moses here, when he's saying, you shall have no other gods before me, but me, only me, is he's trying to say those other 2,029, worthless. Don't even attempt to go back to that way. I know you were there for 430 years. I know you had a life before this. Stop it. What does that mean for us? God is saying, I know you had a life before me. Stop worshiping the things that you used to worship. Stop worshiping the God that you used to worship. And you know what God we all used to worship? The God of self. Stop worshiping yourself. You can't even worship yourself after me. You shall only worship me. We only worship God. And this isn't something that's standalone. We always check verses on other verses. This isn't the only place that he's saying, you shall only worship me and I'm the only God. He says the same thing in Isaiah. Isaiah chapter 45, verse 5. He says, I am the Lord and there is no other. There is no God besides me. That's how blunt and in your face God is getting. Why? Because he is the creator of everything. He is worthy to be praised and worshiped. And he's trying to tell us this. The final point I want to make when it comes to this principle of priority is that we need to put God first. I've talked about how these 10 commandments, they're more than just a list of do's and don'ts. They're more than just a bunch of rules. They are really principles for our life, principles to help us live our life, and principles that will help our relationships. Putting God first not only helps your relationship with God, it helps your relationship with everyone else. Everyone else. Because when we prioritize God, we grow in our love for God and we will grow in our love for others. Look at what Jesus had to say here in Matthew chapter 22. This is after he's being tested. Hey, what's the greatest commandment that there is? We're talking about the 10 commandments. What did Jesus say? Because of course the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the religious leaders of the day are trying to trip him up. And they're saying, okay, what's the greatest commandment that there is? Jesus says to him, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. Does that sound like that last point that we just made, worship God only? He goes on, verse 38, he says, this is the first and great commandment, and the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two hang all the law and all the prophets. But look back there at verse 39, because here's the thing. The second is like it. The second goes with it. The second hangs on it. The second is comparable to it. Love your neighbor as yourself. Here's why that one goes with it. Only after you grow in your love with God can you grow in your love for others. Because only after you grow close to God can you start to see like God. Can you start to hear like God? Can you start to think like God? Only after you've grown close to Him. Only after you've loved Him with everything that you've got can you truly start to love others as yourself. And see, that's the hard part. That's where a lot of us get stuck. Because a lot of us don't love ourselves. A lot of us think less of ourselves. A lot of us let what other people say about us influence the way we think and see ourselves. Well, that just tells me if you think and believe what others are saying, you're listening to them way too much. And you need to start listening to God a little bit more. You need to put Him first. Because then when you put God first, not what your neighbors say, not what your coworkers say, not what your family says, not what your classmates say, not what your friends say. What does God say? What does God say? How does God see you? How does God want you to love yourself? How does God want you to love others? See, I had this moment in my life, in my marriage. I'm a pastor, I'm preaching. I'm studying the Word every single day. I'm praying. But you know what I wasn't doing? I wasn't drawing close to God. I was going through the motions. It had become ritual to open my Bible and read it. It had become ritual to hop in the car and listen to the worship music on the way. What was happening is my eyes are reading the pages, but my mind isn't paying attention. My spirit's not picking anything up. I'm riding in the car, and while I'm hearing that praise music, I'm thinking about what's for lunch. I'm thinking about what I'm going to do when I get home. I'm thinking about all these other things because my heart wasn't in it. And because I wasn't putting God first, and because I was letting that slide, I was letting my marriage slide. And we found ourselves in a situation that I never thought we would be in. We were on the brink of divorce. And it took one minor adjustment to fix things, to miraculously change things. Put God first. Stop focusing on her, start focusing on God. Stop focusing on my marriage, start focusing on God. That seems counterproductive. Trying to save my marriage. Why not focus on my marriage? Because that's not what God said. It's not coincidence that the very first of these priority or principles is priorities. The very first principle, the very first one is God saying, you shall have no other God before me. No other God but me. Don't worship your spouse. Don't worship your marriage. Worship me. I'll take care of everything else. See, what I had was a mentor that talked to me that way. When I would call up and I would complain about what Genevieve did, he listened. And then as soon as I got done venting, he'd be like, all right, Josh, got a quick question for you. Yeah, what's that? Are you obeying Christ? Thanks, Dr. Mark. I'll talk to you later. And I hang up. Because the answer was no. Had I been obeying Christ, there wouldn't have been a problem in the first place. Had I been obeying Christ, had I been putting God first, had I really been growing in my relationship with God, I would have seen what God says. I would have seen her the way that God sees her. I would have seen myself the way that God sees me. What that led me to was what Ephesians shows. And I want to show you here in Ephesians chapter 5. Here's how this plays out. God's saying, wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord. In other words, as you're submitting to your husband, you are submitting to God. As you're doing this to her, you're doing this to me. Which means if you're not doing it, or rather for him, you're not doing it for him. If you're not doing this for your husband, you're not doing it for God. Now I looked at that, and of course this is how that marriage verse, this passage starts out. I'm thinking, yeah, give it to the woman. And then I had to read on. And then it was like, for the husband is the head of the wife. Also, Christ is the head of the church. He's the Savior of the body. But then it goes in and it says, husband, love your wives, just as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for her. And then I was like, oh, yeah. I remember how Jesus did that. Not my will, but yours be done. Forgive them, Father. They don't know what they're doing. Turning the other cheek. Not seeking his own. Laying his life down. Being the ultimate sacrifice. It goes on in verse 28 and it says, so husbands ought to love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. No one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes it and cherishes it, just as the Lord does the church. See, seeing my wife the way that God sees her saved my marriage. Because all of a sudden I realized how precious she was. I realized she's not just Genevieve, she's not just my wife. She is a daughter of the King of Kings. She is a princess. She is precious. And I need to do everything in my power to nourish her, to cherish her, and to esteem her. I have to protect her. I have to provide for her. Because that's what he would do. Because that's what he did. And I see that he has done that, and all he's calling me to do is to be like him. See, when we put God first, all of a sudden, we start to prioritize the right thing, the right one. And when we have put God first, everything else falls into place. When we put God first, we see as God sees. We think as God thinks. We hear as God hears. We learn his ways, not just his acts. And that means we start to know what it is that he has called us to do. And then we get our priorities straight because God is first. If we look at this 10 Commandments, we look at the list. I love the fact that we've got that tapestry back there right above Nancy's head. Hand stitched or woven, I don't even know how they would do that. Crocheted, what is it? Crocheted, Reagan, see that? I don't even know how they did that. But it's beautiful. And we've had that, and it has been prominent. Why? Because for the longest time, I realized it's not just a list of do's and don'ts. These are principles about relationship. If all you see them is a list of do's and don'ts, then all you see is burden placed on you. But putting God first is not a burden, it's a blessing. Following and obeying the 10 Commandments is not a burden, it's a blessing, and it will help us in every area of our life. As we continue to go through this series over the next several weeks, what we're going to be doing is looking at each of these 10 Commandments. And each of these big 10 are principles that we live by, principles that we should live by. All we've got to do is follow them. All we've got to do is obey them. All we've got to do is apply them to our lives. And today, all God is asking you to do is put him first. Have no other God but him. As we finish, I want you to ask what the Holy Spirit is saying to you in this message. What is he speaking to your heart? How is he telling you to prioritize him in your life? Are you giving God the top spot in your life, or is there something else in there? Are you carving out enough time for prayer daily? Are you taking time out of your day every day to read the word that he has laid out before you? It's not hard. You don't have to have a fancy Bible like this, because we've all got one like this. Quite frankly, this one cost more than this one did. Are you taking time daily to really seek out God's will? Think about that. When you get up in the morning and you start, do you already know what you're going to do for the day? And if you do, is that because you actually asked God what you should do, or because you already had a plan in place? What is he saying to you? How is he telling you to prioritize him daily? And what are you determined to do? Because you and only you can determine how deep you go in your relationship with God. When we will implement the principle of priority in our lives, our relationships will be changed. Our families will be changed. Our marriages will be restored. Our communities will come together. And God will take his rightful place in leading us towards the promised land, just as he did Israel. So let's put God first, and let's worship nobody but him. Let's pray.